As I said, this is our first event, and the topic that we chose is a topic that we addressed on the opening day of the website, the threats to free speech on college campuses. In an op-ed by John Yoo and Stephen Hayward, they cited Philadelphia as one of the ground zeros for the anti-free speech movement, specifically mentioning one of tonight's guests as someone targeted by this movement. So let me introduce our guests. Amy Wax is a Robert Mundheim Professor of Law at the University of Pennsylvania. She's currently on leave. Paul Levy is the founder and managing director of JLL Partners, and he is a former Penn trustee and former overseer of Penn Law. He resigned from both of those positions at Penn because of the school's treatment of Amy Wax.
Well, right now, they are completely up in the air. There's still a lot of pressure on the administration, on the dean to not let me return to teaching, to fire me. There's all of this innuendo that complaints are going to be filed. Nobody, of course, is telling me anything because all of this is very secretive and behind closed doors. And the latest event along those lines was a town hall that my dean, Ted Ruger, held with the students a few months ago. I was not told about it. Faculty were barred from it. But a few of the students made some recordings of the proceedings. It consisted of 90 minutes of what a student termed an auto-da-fe. I was very proud of him for knowing what an auto-da-fe was. That was wonderful. It was students complaining for an hour and a half about how traumatized they were, how damaged, how psychologically hurt and harmed and destroyed they were by the mere fact that I was a professor at their law school, that I was sitting down the hall in my office. And this was something that just completely disabled them from functioning as law students and lawyers. What's even more interesting is that the dean egged them on. He said, I'm sorry, but there are some speed bumps. You know, I can't fire her right away. What's the negative pregnant there? I'd like to fire her, and I'm doing the best I can. Write down all of your complaints. He added, yes, she's a racist, she's a bigot. She uses white supremacist language. She's received awards from fringe groups, the National Association of Scholars, which is the last fringe group you could possibly imagine. And what he didn't say, which could have ended it all in a moment, is, I'm sorry, but your complaints are out of line. There's nothing to see here. Professors express their views. That's what they're here for. And he could have gone on to say, and this is sort of the last point I want to make, and you as future lawyers need to be able to handle different arguments, pro and con, all sorts of points of view, not just being able to confront them without wilting and taking to your bed, but actually making those arguments, getting inside them. That is what lawyers do. And by saying the things you're saying today, you have shown that you are ill-equipped to be a lawyer. The kind of woke social justice mentality displayed by the students at this meeting is incompatible with good lawyering. The people at this meeting should probably rethink their career choice and seek employment elsewhere. And I have had partners, as I go talk around the country, say to me, please do not send me any more social justice warriors, judges as well. We don't like having these people in our law firm. They can't deal with opposing arguments that don't represent approved opinion. They can't think of opposing arguments. They're not very good at making opposing arguments. And to boot, they're involved in monitoring the environment for any sort of infraction of political correctness. And that's not the kind of colleague that we want to work with.
It's her point of view. If you don't agree with that, that's fine. You're entitled to your point of view. She has her point of view. He said, well, you know, we really have to do something. I said, well, why? He said, well, if we don't step up, we may not get minorities to apply to Penn law. And I said, well, they come for free. They wouldn't get in otherwise, right? I don't accept your premise that they won't come. And that's where we left it. I promptly thereafter resigned. I wrote my letter of resignation to the university. And that's where it stands. But the key point and what's going on around the country is administrators are running amok. They are not being disciplined. There seems to be very little, if any, dialogue with the boards that are responsible, at least responsible for the presidents of the universities. And that's where it stands. I did get several calls from professors who felt they could not speak up. That's a really uncomfortable thing. I got calls from students who felt that they could not speak up. So the quality of dialogue at these institutions, and it's the case across America, is being homogenized. And that is the great risk. That is the great risk.
Universities are not entitled to values. I know that sounds like a radical idea, but it's written into the Chicago principles. No, universities don't have values, people have values. And if the university embraces a mission or values, that means that people who don't agree with them, that take a different view, are on the outs. And of course, most of the stuff that universities have values about, diversity, inclusion, and equity, sounds wonderful, but there are real political differences out there about the importance, the priority, and the value of those values and what they should mean. Now, maybe not on the East Coast and on the main line and at Penn, but I know plenty of deplorables who think that diversity is like meh. They would list 6, 7, 8 priorities they have in their life and for society before diversity would even enter their brain. Right? So that's why universities should not have values. It's a way to get rid of people who don't agree with the progressive agenda.
Well, and they're not published. So I don't know that if they exist, they're not articulated, they're not written, and nobody's asked to sign up to them when becoming part of the community. So even worse, they're Kafkaesque. They can change depending on the day and the month. We are in a very civil, not so subtle, serious wave of repression. It's repression. And the worst part of repression is fear. Those who have the courage to speak up can fight, like Amy. She may lose, but she can fight. It's really fearful when people look over their shoulders and are afraid to share their views with somebody, afraid to express them, afraid to put forth a point of view about a particular subject. It's very uncomfortable. And that's sort of where it's at right now.
When I was growing up, my father, who was not a particularly educated man, belonged to the ACLU, back when the ACLU really was the ACLU. And you may recall that the Klan or the neo-Nazis marched through Skokie, Illinois. This was when I was a kid. I was a teenager, actually. And there was a big deal about it because there were a lot of Holocaust survivors in that community. And my father said to me, I wake up every morning and thank God that I live in a country where the Klan can march through Skokie. He said that to me. And I have never forgotten it. I have never forgotten it. And we need to get back to that. We need to get back to being grateful that we live in a country where people can say, outrageous things. I don't want the night to end without saying something critical, which is it starts with K through 12. K through 12 is completely and totally corrupted by progressive, woke, shibboleths and politics and propaganda. I mean, some of the stories I've heard would make your hair stand on end. But you're taking these uninformed students, and of course they're more ignorant than ever. Right? They live in the eternal present because they don't know anything. And here's a quote from Camille Paglia, our native daughter here, who teaches at the University of the Arts. She said recently, too many young people raised in affluent liberal homes, and I would add just raised in any home across the country, are arriving at elite colleges with skittish, unformed personalities and shockingly narrow views of human existence, confined to inflammatory and divisive identity politics. And that is what they learn from kindergarten on, is identity politics.
Thank you.
Let me make one point, if I may. Excuse me. It's very. Think about your own life. Think where you were 10 years ago. If you're old enough, think about where you were 15 years ago, 20 years ago. It feels like yesterday. The problem is immediate. It's growing. It's metastasizing at geometric rates. Because the people now at these universities, and who have been at universities for the past 10 years, time flies. They become the professors, and they become the administrators, and they become the leaders of various, activities in our society. This is a now problem. This is not a growing problem. This is a here problem.
It's one thing to embrace that concept as an abstraction. It does sound good, but I think the real test is on the ground. When someone says something, Trumpian or immigration restrictive or, something about groups that might not be terribly flattering, or makes like an observation and about something they see in front of their very eyes, which of course we're not supposed to notice,
Right.
and something specific, then how do they react? And I think that's where teachers really fall down. I don't know, I'm not talking about you, but I think that's where administrators fall down. They will receive complaints from students about such statements about other students. They will allow students to complain that they were hurt, that they were upset, that they were offended, that they're vulnerable. That's a term that was trotted out the other day for my benefit. Vulnerable. My view is, I'm sorry, but if you're vulnerable, maybe you don't belong in college. Maybe you don't belong in law school. I mean, has that ever occurred to you? You're just going to have to suck up your vulnerability. So these words are words that are weaponized.
Right.
They are weaponized because they become the sort of trump card, excuse the expression, that supersedes and cuts off any kind of reasonable exchange. And I think that is what is happening today, on a day-to-day basis in our educational system.
This has been a video production of Broad and Liberty, your source for thought-provoking, shareable content in Greater Philadelphia and beyond.